All right, so we went back to our original Illustrator file and we just selected it. You see I separated into a black logo and a color logo. And then I tried to change it to red, or I tried to change it to green, but it will only show me different gray values. And that's because we live traced this one. If we didn't live trace it, it would allow me to. But when you live trace as a black and white logo, it limits the Illustrator options to only grayscale options. So how do I get around that? It's actually pretty simple. I simply copy it all and then say File New, right? A new Illustrator file. Doesn't really matter what the size is. And then you say Edit, Paste in Place, right? And then you can go in. See, and I should be able to do color, but I need it to be a print file. There we go. Okay, so when you do your new Illustrator file, you want to be on the print settings, and that will give you the full color options. And then paste in place. And it still won't let me. What is going on? Sometimes you have to trick it. There we go. Okay. So instead of trying to choose the color from here, once you're in a print file, you can choose the color from your properties groups. But once you have color, then all of the coloring options within Illustrator are unlocked, right? So Illustrator tries to kind of outthink you sometimes, which is very annoying. See how it has no color options there? Because that's the one I live traced as a black and white logo. But on this one, I've got all the color options. Once you have all the color options, you can do just like what you did in Photoshop with layer styles. I can fill the whole thing in with one color, or I can fill it in with a gradation. So you can see here I have gradient options. But the difference is this will treat each individual path individually. So let's say I create a gradient and I go between blue and orange. This is a pretty important difference between Photoshop and Illustrator. And I can, of course, really customize all of these options. Right now I'm just using some of the presets. Okay, and I can set the angle for them. It's just a slightly different way of playing with it. And I can play with, how long they go. This is what's called scale of the gradient. Maybe I can swap them so the darker green's near the bottom. I can make this a darker blue near the top. But notice the big difference here. That gradient is filling every individual path. So that's the big difference coloring within Illustrator versus coloring in Photoshop. Because here I could color each individual path individually and keep it as a vector. So for instance, let's take this little tile, and if I just wanted to fill that in with a solid blue, I could. Or a solid other color. Now that I've unlocked all the color options, that's not a problem. So let's see, what would be an interesting way to utilize this? I could choose primary colors for these. I can mix my own. But only when they're self-contained paths will that work. Let's do full cyan. No, let's do full magenta. They're print colors. Oh, let's do full cyan and magenta. It's another one I could play with. This one here to balance it. Let's make that one full yellow and full magenta. There we go. So that might give, a little extra pop to the design. Now, some of the fun other things you can try is because I'm doing a gradient fill, let's look at some of those gradient fill options. You can actually, instead of having it always be solid, I can make the gradient fill a lower opacity at any step. So I'm going to do 0% opacity at the edge there. And if I do 0% opacity, look what happens. And I can make this one maybe 60% opacity. So now, on every path where I'm using that gradient fill, if I put it onto gray, the gray is going to mix into it. And you see how the hand starts to look like it disappears? So that can be kind of helpful, right? And if I wanted to paint the fingernails of my hand, and I want to match a color choice I've already made, I can use what's called the eyedropper tool. And it will simply match, right? So let's use the direct selection tool, select that fingernail, and then use the eyedropper tool. And so I can take each path and paint it individually. That is not something you have an option for within Photoshop when you're doing your coloring. And I'm thinking this red is just too strong. So I'm going to replace it. I'm going to select this one and hold down Shift and Command and that one. Oh, but that got too much, so I'll just do one at a time. And use the eyedropper tool and fill them in with this blue instead. And so we'll just swap it. You can also do that with the gradient fill. So once you find a coloring approach you like, you can use it over and over and over again. And I'm not sure what this means. This is weird now. What if I want to select all of this? I can use the eyedropper on multiple paths and fill them at once. I'm using the lasso to select multiple contained paths. Use the eyedropper, fill them all in at once. Same thing with these. So what I recommend is once you have your black EPS in Photoshop, play with layer styles and get a sense for the different coloring options that you think will actually help your design. Because anyone can color something, but how do you actually make it stand out? And then the other thing, with that lasso, you can see how I can separate out individual paths. But also just with my direct selection tool, what if I want the whole hand to be just filled in with a solid color? Or with a different gradient entirely? You know, I can do that. So lots of different coloring options. But generally, logos should be fairly straightforward. So you get to decide what's best. What I'm going to do, let's see. I'm going to color with just a simple light blue. And then match that. Some of these other areas. So that all the color is in the globe. And I'm going to take all the hand and all these little marks and just make that all that light blue. Now, because I'm not using something that's transparent anymore, maybe I can play with that a little bit on the hand now, just individually. Just this shape, I can play with a gradient that has a 0% opacity for part of it, right? But I can change the angle. So it kind of fades out slowly. And I can extend that to all of these. Huh. Let's do it this way. By using the eyedropper, it will carry that gradient over. Okay. Now, if you want to layer different colors, like we do with layer styles, like a gradient on top of another color. So for instance, like these, if I wanted to layer those, it's a little bit of a pain to do, but you can do it. You simply have to duplicate those paths, right? So I'm going to take my small selection tool, select it, hold down Command and Shift, select, it won't let me. Select one, copy it, go to a new layer, paste in place, and then on the one on top, I'm going to use the dropper to move this kind of fading opacity color on top. So I have it layered in a way that it's kind of nice. And then I can do that same thing with the yellow. And I can copy it, paste it into the new layer, paste in place. Remember, if you don't paste in place, you'll have to reposition it, which is a pain. Copy that on. And of course, I can always play with the angle. So we're getting there. And then if I like that, I might extend that to more shapes where I steal the color. Like for those, I can copy, put them onto an overlaying layer, paste in place, and then use the eyedropper and take that color selection over the top. So that it looks like the earth is kind of bleeding from those squares. So many options. And the eyedropper tool for coloring, it's just like the pencil tool. You can hold down Option and get back to this, or hold down Command to get back to the Select tool while you're using it, which is very handy.
So that's why I'm using this.
Paste in place. There we go. So now I'm having fun breaking up all these shapes. But it can be hard coming up with color solutions that you're happy with, right? First, I'm going to replace this with yellow. And then on top, I'm going to replace it with that fill.